Hello, we are at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. My name is Renate Frydman Ph.D. I am a docent at the museum. Today we are going to speak about the Holocaust. This picture shows the train station in Frankfurt, Germany, and this is actually my very first memory in life. I remember somehow the bright light, which I always thought was above, but since I've seen pictures, it was directly in front of me probably. I was a very small person in a very, very large space, and my parents were taking me out of Nazi Germany to hopefully safety. And even though I was only 2 and didn't really know what was going on, I was very, it left a tremendous impression on me. All my life, when trains came really close to me, I had this funny feeling in the pit of my stomach. It never went away from that day of being on that platform in that building. We were not going on a pleasure trip, and we were actually just running, basically. So it was November 10th, 1938, and if you know your history real well, that was Kristallnacht, or Night of Breaking Glass. From the night before, it went on a day and a night, or probably 2 nights and a day, and we were fleeing Nazi Germany at the very beginning of the Holocaust, November 9th and 10th, 1938. This picture, these 2 pictures, actually depict the apartment house where I lived from the time I was born till the time we left, when I was 2. And the older picture was in my mother's photograph album, but I didn't see that till years later. I had a friend who went to Frankfurt with her husband on business, and I had given her the address that my mother gave me, and she actually went there and took the newer photograph for me so that I could see, and it was the only house at the time on the street that hadn't been bombed out and was still there. And it's exactly there, the pictures of the balconies, which I have pictures now of that with my mother on one of those balconies. And that's also the place where someone threw a rock down from that building on my baby carriage, and although I wasn't injured, that's what made, and I'll tell you what the next slide, what happened. This is a picture of my grandfather on my mother's side. His name was Max May. He was an artist and an architect. He was also a veteran of the First World War, of course, from his country of Germany. He was an officer. He was awarded a medal called the Iron Cross for his bravery. But when the laws were passed against the Jews in Germany, my grandfather, along with all the other Jewish people and all the other military people who had fought for Germany in the First World War, were no longer considered citizens of that country. That angered my grandfather, plus the fact that the rock had been dropped and it was considered an anti-Semitic act. He, unlike many others, saw what was coming and decided he wanted to leave right away and come to the United States. And that's what he did. He left. My grandmother was brave enough to let him go, and he came to the United States in 1937. These 2 pictures are the front and back of my immigration card to the United States. The upper picture with the picture on it is of me at about 2 or 1.5, and it is signed by the president of police in the German government letting me go, and the lower one is of the United States government when we entered. This is a picture of my actual passport. On the left side, you will see the date and a red letter J on the upper, on your upper left-hand side when you're looking at it. As you can imagine, the red letter J was for Jew, and that was so that no country would take us in unless we were headed directly for that country. It designated our religion. If you were traveling today with a passport, it would not carry your religion on it. And on the right, you will notice that it is the swastika with the eagle, which was the symbol of the German government during the Nazi era. In today's world, even a swastika will bring pure terror to survivors and many other people that know what it stood for. It is absolutely against the law in Germany to have a swastika or show a swastika. The next picture that you see is a picture of myself at the age of 8. It was the only real formal picture I'd taken in those years. And of course, I was going to public school at the time, probably in the 3rd grade. And I had already started experiencing extreme prejudice directed against me. And when you're a small child, you don't understand why. But I was one of only 5 Jewish kids in the entire school of about 1,000, K through 8. And there was name calling, and there was chasing me home from school. And so I understood prejudice as I got older. And I also learned by the 7th and 8th grade, some of those people became my friends, that once you get to know a person, a lot of the prejudices drop away. Or you can like them or dislike them for who they are. These 2 pictures are of the father and mother of my late husband, who I met when I was in my teens. He was a real survivor of the Holocaust. He was born in Poland, and he lost his parents along with his 2 younger sisters during the Holocaust. His name in Polish was Anschel, pronounced Anschel. On the left is his father, and this is the only picture in the entire world of his father. His father was only 31 when he was taken away and killed by the Nazis. And on the right is his mother, who was, I was told, a very beautiful woman. His mother was only 30 when she was taken to the Treblinka death camp along with her 2 daughters. She somehow managed to save my late husband when he was close to 13 by getting him on a truck that when they had been marched to the train station, they were almost there. She got a man that she knew from her town who was in charge there somehow of driving the truck and begging him to put her son, Anschel or Charlie later, on the truck with other young men who were going to be taken to a workplace. However, being who he was, when they got close to his town, there was a bridge, and they went over the bridge. He jumped off the truck and went and hid in a cemetery right nearby. And the man on the truck who had the gun, who was controlling it, did not go after him because he had this whole truckload of people that he had to watch. So he hid in the cemetery, and he was alone in the world. This picture that you see now is the only picture in the world that has his father in it. And the story is unusual because all the years first years that I knew my late husband, he did have a picture of his mother, a small picture that he had with him throughout the war. And he had asked many people from his town and relatives that were, had gone to other places before the war, if they had a picture of his father, and he was always told no. In 1975, we went to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to visit some distant cousins of his mother's. And one night when we were looking through albums of pictures, he yelled, "Renate, come quickly. This is a picture of my father." And that's how we found this picture, and of course they gave it to us, the little picture. In the meantime, we've had bigger pictures made of it. But his father, looking at it, is the second man on the left. Everyone in this picture was killed during the Holocaust, including 2 children, one in front and one hiding in the back, behind the man with the beard, who was his grandfather's brother. And that tells you a lot about how valuable that picture is. These 2 pictures are of Pionki in Poland, and this was the only munitions factory in the entire country, which the Germans immediately took over and created a slave labor camp there. There was about seven times around it was barbed wire, and although they weren't killed there, the young people that were sent there to work, it was still a very dangerous place. And after several other escapes, Anschel did end up with some other young men on a truck that headed for Pionki. And when he looked at it and he saw the amount of barbed wire, he said to himself, this place is not going to be so easy to escape from. And outside of this factory, this munitions factory, was hundreds of miles of forest, thick, deep forest. So at one point he did make plans, Anschel, with 6 other young men to escape at night. However, a German guard asked him to help deliver some food, which he couldn't refuse, and so he didn't make the departure time. The others managed to get a certain distance, and then they were all captured, and the next morning they were all hung in the courtyard of the factory, and everybody was made to watch. And that still did not stop Anschel from wanting to escape and find a better place. His escape is really the crux of his story, because when I was writing his book, I checked with the major museums that I knew of to see if other people had escaped from Pionki, and I can tell you that I could not find anyone. What happened to most of the people at Pionki was when they were done with their time there, they were sent to Auschwitz. Some survived Auschwitz, but none escaped from, that I could find. None escaped from Pionki itself. This picture is of a village on the edge of the forest in Poland. And when Anschel finally escaped from Pionki by himself, he ended up in the forests of Poland that went for hundreds of miles through Poland and into Russia. He managed to survive for 3 years in the forest. That story is a long story, but I will tell you that he ended up with a small group of young men. They had a bunker that they dug in the ground. They moved around at night and mostly slept in the day, but that was the opposite of the Germans. However, the Germans that were surrounding that forest were very much afraid to go into the depth of the forest, because there were groups of people called partisans who actually fought with the Germans in the forests. And food was very scarce, so they picked things like mushrooms or wild berries, but when they could go, and they sometimes sent Anschel ahead because he did not look Jewish. He was blonde, he had a ruddy complexion, he spoke perfect Polish. They sent him into a village like this that you see here to scout it out and see if it was worth for the group to go in and get some foods of some kind. This is a picture of Anschel's cousin, Pincus, who was a doctor with the soccer team from Brazil. His visit to that hometown, Jeglinsk, was after the war had ended by quite a long time. And so he gave this picture with the sign of the town, which still looks pretty old-fashioned even after the war. It was a very small town. It was liberated by the Russian army. Anschel found his way back to his hometown after he was liberated in the forest by the Russians and was able to go back. And there were 10 or so other young people from his hometown who were Jewish who had survived out of dozens and dozens of people who had been killed. And they stayed together for a short time until they got a notice from the Nazis that if they continued to inhabit the town, that they would be killed. This picture is of Nathan and Ethel Weisman, who came to Dayton before the Second World War because he had family here in Dayton. And they were from Anschel's hometown in Poland, and they happened to have been good friends with his parents. After the war, they discovered that Anschel was living on a Red Cross list, and they sent him papers that he could come to the United States and to Dayton, Ohio, and he did. And he went to New York for a few days until he came to Dayton. He came October 23rd, 1950. This is the last picture that was taken of Anschel, who was by then Charlie, in the United States in Dayton, Ohio. But I want to tell you about how we met. We met 6 months after he arrived in 1950. And I fell in love with this very brave young person who had lived through some of the worst things you can imagine. All his relatives killed, who were innocent men, women, and children. When we got married, we still had the hope of establishing a home and family. We were married for 51 years when he passed away suddenly in September of 2004. My wish had always been that we'd grow old together, but that was not to happen. However, I was able to write a book about Anschel's story, which that's the name of the book, from tapes that I had made of him throughout the last 20 years that we were together. I have been speaking at schools for years about the Holocaust. I teach the children, hoping that with education, people would never let anything like the Holocaust happen again, especially in this great country of ours. I emphasize to young people that prejudice and bullying is how the Holocaust started, and I related to events that happen almost daily in our country or somewhere in the world. This is the entrance to the Holocaust Prejudice and Memory exhibit that is now permanently at the Museum of the United States Air Force. We wanted to have something at first movable that we could take some of the artifacts, if there were any, from survivors and liberators and a righteous Gentile around our Dayton area. So it did travel for a year and a half, but in the early time when we were at a high school, someone called from the museum and asked to visit the museum and suggested to General Metcalf, the director, that the museum should take that exhibit. It was opened museum was opened in 1999, which is already past 22 years, and it became a permanent exhibit in the museum. The museum staff created an entrance which included the words over the entrance, Arbeit macht frei, which translated means work makes free. It was over a number of concentration camps throughout Europe, including Auschwitz and Dachau, and it is the Great Lie. This is a picture of a case that holds a uniform that was actually worn in Buchenwald, one of the largest concentration camps in Europe. And there is a small picture of the man who wore it. The reason I got the uniform was that it had been worn by a friend's father who was in Buchenwald, and he was in there as a young boy with his father. The numbers are not tattooed, but on his uniform there. And it isn't a regular uniform like you see sometimes. It's actually like a coat, and usually you will see two pieces with the stripes like that. And I had it in my hands, and it felt very cold and clammy. And one child even said what stories that uniform could tell. It had been kept in my friend's home under dark plastic for over 50 years. And museum people will tell you that usually things don't last well that way, but it actually preserved itself. And it's now displayed in a special case under low lighting, which is acid-free, so that it'll have a better chance of surviving. This picture is of a violin, which looks not too bad in this picture. However, in person, it does look very worn and torn. This violin was played by one of our survivors in Dayton, Bob Kahn, on Kristallnacht. When he came home from school at the age of 15, there were 3 Nazis in his home. They were beating his father and had his mother tied up. When the Nazis in his home saw the violin in the corner and he came in, they said that he had to play the violin, play happy German songs. And he had to do it. He was forced. When the time was over and they left the apartment, he was able to hide this very violin in the attic of his apartment house in Mannheim, Germany. He was fortunate to be able to come to the United States and even served in the United States Army during the Second World War. When the war was over and he came back to his home in Vandalia, he wrote to the caretaker of this apartment house and asked if the violin was still there in Mannheim in the attic, and it was, and they sent it to his home near Dayton, Ohio, where he kept it in his attic for 50 more years until he decided to give it to us to use in the exhibit. This picture is of an accordion and a suitcase behind it. It's very interesting because this accordion was owned by his later-to-be wife, whom of course he did not know when they were both in Germany. She was 11 years old, Gert, when she was put on a train to England as part of the Kinder Transport, which was the program that Britain used to save Jewish children between 1938 and when the war started in 1939. They were able to save 10,000 Jewish children and have them fostered or adopted by people. And that's what happened to Gertrude. Children who went on the transport were allowed 2 suitcases, and she chose to have 1 suitcase and her precious accordion in the case as her second. And she kept the accordion with her in England and later brought it to the United States. Eventually, Bob and Gert were married, and they've been married over 75 years. They're both still living, and quite a bit after Bob gave us the violin, she decided to give us the accordion. These are part of a wall that normally goes all the way across the back of the hallway where we are situated at the museum. And there are a total of 31 black and white photography taken by a photographer from Tucson, Arizona, who gave us these when we first started the exhibit and we're traveling with it. They are still with us, all 31. The cases contain artifacts that were given to me and people were able to save or got after the Holocaust. Survivors gave them. There's a sign back there. You see it in black and yellow background that says Jewish lawyer. Germans use German lawyers. And it is translated from the German. That sign was put on the business of a Jewish lawyer in Berlin in 1936, and his daughter, who survived, came to the United States and lives in Dayton, and I was told about the sign, and I really wanted it for our exhibit. One thing about that sign, if you saw it in person, would tell you that it is a very racist sign. This is a picture of Henry, who has since passed away, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he went through a great many camps. And he had the tattoo or branding on his arm. And I had asked Henry if he would be willing to have a picture made of him with the tattoo numbers on the arm. That wasn't tattooing like people have today. That was branding a person. And they were known from then on only by the number and not by their name. You all know how important your name is to you and your identity. This was a really difficult time and a horrific time for people to have that on their arm. And for the most part, people did not erase those numbers, and they lived with them to the end of their life. Jewish people actually are not supposed to mark on their skin or have anything like a tattoo, although there will be people you meet who are Jewish who have tattoos occasionally, especially if they were in the armed services. But it's really against our religion, and the Nazis knew that. This is part of a wall or a very large piece of remembrance that was designed and made by Veit Parker of Display Dynamics in Dayton, in the Dayton area. And it has 2 sides, the entire piece, and it was to be movable because we were moving around, but it was extremely heavy, and it went into 9 parts. It represents the fact that there were people from the greater Dayton area that were involved in the Holocaust, whether they were liberators, righteous Gentiles, or survivors, and it tells us a very little bit about their story. We also have on the museum's website the detailed story in a booklet form that is in depth of some of their stories. Behind there, you see children behind broken glass, which signifies the day of Kristallnacht, or broken glass, and that was his design, which I thought was brilliant, and that I was hoping children would never be behind barbed wire again, as these children were. They were Polish children. The other thing about this is that there were pictures that people had very minimally from before or after the Holocaust. And there is a picture in the center part of Bob Kahn with his violin after the war in more recent years. And there's also a picture from Kristallnacht of a synagogue that was totally destroyed inside in Mannheim, Germany. And it shows a picture before and after the Holocaust. This is the other side of the Wall of Remembrance. And it has the theme that it represents your neighbors, because at one time, all these people lived in the greater Dayton area. There are people on the left who were called righteous Gentiles, who risked their own lives to save Jewish people during the war. Most of them were from Holland. There was one family from the Ukraine where very few Jews were saved that hid a young girl in their attic for 2 years during the war. And in the center are some pictures of our survivors and their families, some of whom, and many of whom, did not survive. And the third panel is of liberators, American soldiers who came into the camps, either the day of liberation or later. And it shows them in uniform and as they were in recent years. Most of the people in this exhibit are no longer living, unfortunately, but we do have their stories to tell and to remind us of what happens when a dictator takes over. This is a picture of a drawing that one of our liberators made after he came back from the war, because he was a soldier, an American soldier, who was a medic, and he was sent into the camp with other soldiers to try to bring some order about, and it was of Dachau. And what Fred saw there has never left him in his entire life. He's, of course, gone quite a long time now, but it haunted him terribly. And he had drawn the map when he first came over. He was in that camp for 23 days as a medic, and it never left him. This is the cover of the book that I wrote after Anschel, or Charlie, as was his American name, passed away. I had done 9 tapes with him in our last 20 years together, and they were done at different times in different situations, and I asked him to talk some more about his story, which I had heard parts of, but I thought that maybe we would write a book together for the family, but as it turned out, he was gone and I had to write the book alone. It took 7 years after he passed away before I could listen to the tapes, transcribe them, and write the story. And it is now available in the gift shop at the museum or through Amazon. But it is an unbelievable story of a very young teenager, 13 to 17 years of age, determined to survive so someone could tell the story of what happened. That was my story. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you soon at the museum.